It's 5 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. World leaders in New York City. The UN General Assembly set to kick off in Midtown Manhattan. President Trump is scheduled to speak. Plain diplomacy. The U.S. ambassador to China says Washington and Beijing are in talks for a huge Boeing aircraft order. And U.S. stocks hit another record high of the year. Investors awaiting Fed Chair Powell's speech later today and the latest PMI data. And that's where we stand futures-wise after that massive AI rally yesterday. Really, NVIDIA-linked stocks did extraordinarily well. Futures were mixed a little moment ago. We did get some upgrades from the OECD, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and that's helping them back to flat. As you can see, nothing much going on. There's some parsing of Stephen Myron's speech at the Economic Club in New York yesterday, and also a big focus on what Powell will say. Let's take a look at yields, because we are seeing the picture relatively stable in yields, I have to say. The 2-year yield inching up ever so slightly, and the 30-year staying where we were. The 10-year inching up ever so slightly as well, 412.73. And I do want to mention, we're not that far off the 3,800 mark for gold. So gold continues to rally as rate cut hopes continue. And also don't forget, we're staring down now fourth quarter earnings season. A couple of stragglers after the close today as well, like Micron and AutoZone, but then we'll be into the next quarter. So let's get to some individual stocks to watch now with Valerie Teitel in London. Valerie.
Good morning, Bonnie. Let's start with a check on NVIDIA, because as you mentioned, it very much powered the equity market rally of yesterday, rising 4% in the session yesterday, giving back some of those gains, but just slightly, down 0.7%. Yesterday's session actually saw NVIDIA's share price close at a record high, and it lifted the S&P 500 to its 28th record so far this year, all in the back of optimism in AI because of that deal they signed with OpenAI, a $100 billion deal. Details still to be worked out, but frankly, it's seen as positive to global tech stocks. Let's move on to other deals. This one in the aircraft space. As you mentioned, the U.S. and China are inching closer to a huge deal for Boeing aircraft. Boeing stock is up less than 2% so far in pre-market trade. Now, this huge deal, Bloomberg first reported on it back in August, could total up to 500 Boeing aircraft planes. That would be one of the largest ever aircraft deals assigned, and is perhaps just another example of thawing relations between the U.S. and China after that TikTok deal was signed last week. Lastly, let's move over to Kenvue. This is the Tylenol maker. These shares have been absolutely everywhere. Yesterday's session, they closed at an all-time low, down 7%. They're now up 6% in pre-market, so erasing yesterday's decline. And this is on the back of all these worries about what President Trump was going to announce in the Oval Office yesterday. It seems like the market just thinks that the fears yesterday were overdone, but he did call for pregnant women to avoid Tylenol, and it's drawing sharp criticism from researchers and scientists who say that Trump's remarks misrepresent science and ignore decades of evidence. The president announced the changes to the FDA policy in the White House yesterday.
Effective immediately, the FDA will be notifying physicians that the use of acetaminophen, is that okay? Which is basically commonly known as Tylenol, during pregnancy, can be associated with a very increased risk of autism.
All right, Valerie, thank you so much. That is Valerie Teitel there in London. And later in the show, don't miss our conversation with Kit Juckes, head of FX strategy at Societe Generale. But I want to bring you those OECD headlines now. The OECD sees U.S. GDP rising 1.8% this year now and 1.5% in 2026. Globally, the OECD has raised its this year's global GDP forecast to 3.2% from 2.9%. It still sees 2026 global GDP rising 2.9%. And in terms of the euro area, growth of 1.2% this year, 1% next year. China's growth, 4.9% this year, 4.4% next year. The OECD saying it's still to see the full effect of tariffs on the global economy. Global leaders then flowing into New York for the 80th United Nations General Assembly. Among them, President Trump set to speak later this morning. For more, I'm joined now by Bloomberg's Suzanne Lynch. So, Suzanne, what message will the president want to send out? What's on his agenda?
Well, look, I mean, he is due to address the UN today, and people are really watching to see what is the tenor of his comments. There are obviously a number of international issues top of the agenda. Chief among these are the Middle East and the Israel-Gaza war. What has been significant over the last 24 hours out of New York is that move by a number of countries, including France, to recognise the state of Palestine. That follows similar moves by Canada, Australia and the United Kingdom. So obviously the United States is not on the same page when it comes to this issue. So it will be very interesting to see Donald Trump's comments on that. Obviously, the other big international issue on the agenda is Ukraine, and we have seen a number of incursions by Russian drones into beyond Ukraine, into Europe, over the last few weeks, including Estonia and Poland. And there are a number of meetings taking place on the sidelines at the UN. So I think a lot of US allies will be watching this speech carefully to see if Donald Trump reiterates his commitment to NATO and whether he is prepared to keep supporting Ukraine, and any update on this promised meeting with Putin and whether any possibility of a ceasefire is in the offing.
A lot on the agenda, plus the fact that the US owes the United Nations more than $3 billion. Separately, domestically, the Democrats are planning to meet with Trump this week to try and broker a deal and avert that shutdown. Does any agreement look likely?
Yes, I mean, I think it would be significant if this meeting takes place. I mean, we haven't seen much interaction, shall we say, between Democrats and Donald Trump since he came back into office for the second time. So the US president has indicated that he would be prepared to meet Democrats. So that is a sign that maybe something is in the offing here. I mean, the issue at hand is the issue of healthcare, really. These are the healthcare provisions that are in that bill. And Democrats, I think, really eye a political opportunity here. They know that those Obamacare premiums tax cuts are very popular among constituents. They want to extend those, but Republicans are opposed to this. So the Democrats look like they're not backing down. Neither, the Republicans don't need them. Need 7 Democrat votes for this to go through. Democrats put forward their own proposal. Obviously, it does not have some support. So we are at some kind of stalemate on this. But yes, signs that there will be conversations maybe as early as Thursday this week.
All right, Suzanne, thank you so much. Suzanne Lynch there. Washington and Beijing, meanwhile, in the final stages of talks over what officials are calling a huge order for Boeing aircraft. This after a delegation of US lawmakers ended 2 days of meetings with Chinese leaders in Beijing. Take a listen to US Ambassador to China, David Perdue.
This is a huge order, and it's very important to the president. It's very important to Boeing. I think it's very important to China. And I think that we're in the last days of that, or weeks of that negotiation, and we're hopeful that that will turn out to be the case.
For more now, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Brendan Murray, who leads our global trade coverage, and Jill Deasis in Hong Kong. So, Brendan, what's the latest on the plane order? Apparently, it's contingent on hostilities ceasing. Is there any prospect of that?
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like it's caught up in the broader trade negotiations between the U.S. and China. And the President Trump, for months, has wanted to do this deal with Beijing, similar to the one that he did in his first term, but it would include this massive purchase of Boeing airplanes, something on the order of 500 planes, and ending Boeing's drought of sales to China that's been going on since 2017. So this is going to be the centerpiece of any sort of trade deal that President Trump and Xi can put together. They're going to speak in little over a month, face-to-face at the APEC meeting in Korea. So we'll see if it comes together by then. But this is something that the president of the U.S. wants many countries to do, is to make big purchases of symbolic American manufacturing goods like Boeing aircraft in the trade deals that he's trying to negotiate with other countries around the world.
And it certainly seems like it'll be roughly the same size as the China order from Airbus as well. Jill, what have this week's talks achieved for Beijing?
Well, as Brendan was sort of suggesting there, what we're really looking at is something that's kind of paving the way for that potential Trump-Xi meeting that could be taking place at the end of October, early November. I mean, you've got this, group that's been meeting with a lot of prominent Chinese officials. They did have a meeting the other day with Li Cheng. He's the #2 in China. That was interesting out of that was that Li actually kind of called it an icebreaker meeting, suggesting again that it's that idea of really paving the way for that broader meeting between their two leaders in a few weeks' time. I did think one thing that was really interesting that came out of some of these discussions this week, though, was that the leading Democrat who attended this delegation, Adam Smith, so he's the former chair of the Armed Services Committee, he actually said that there were some unresolved issues that he had spotted just as a result of some of these conversations. One thing that he pulled out in particular was an unresolved issue involving rare earths. So rare earths metals, China really has a massive amount of control over this material used in everything from advanced technologies, EVs, that kind of thing. It's been a really significant point of leverage in the ongoing trade negotiations with the United States, and something that the U.S. and China had reached a framework agreement earlier this summer that we didn't get a ton of details on. And so it does sound like that's still a sticking point. But I think, overall, you're still looking at two countries that are still trying to pave the way for that eventual leaders meeting.
So, Brendan, definitely negotiations have been ongoing, more junior staff and now, officials and plenty of meetings all over the world, not just in China. But what will it mean for actual tariffs at the end of the day? Are we still going to see these individual tariffs put on individual types of goods and then Section 232 investigations come along and we have a whole new problem on our hands?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all of those are points of leverage that the U.S. Would apply on China and vice versa. So I think the bottom line here is that the talks are trending slowly in the right direction. The two sides are talking, which is sort of the foundation of any sort of agreement that might be reached down the road. But the tenor of the talks is positive. It was only a couple months ago that President Trump said, so much for Mr. Nice Guy when it came to China. So it's the two sides are the mood music is positive, and they seem to be on track towards some kind of deal, either as we've said at APEC in several weeks, or sometime in the not too distant future. Something that President Trump can hang on his record and say, look at all these Boeing jobs I created. Look at the soybean purchase that China agreed to, if it comes to that. So that's really what the end game is.
Jill, China has been sending its exports to the rest of the world as President Trump's tariffs have come into effect, as you might expect any economy to try and do, right? And we're just getting the OECD saying that the Chinese economy will grow 4.9% this year, 4.4% next year. What kind of state is the Chinese economy in?
Yeah, Bonnie, it's been a really interesting year, I think, for the Chinese economy. So on the one hand, you do have those exports certainly surging. I mean, you're looking at record trade surpluses likely to end out the year. Obviously, China has done a pretty good job of averting some of the U.S. tariffs by just exporting to other places. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese economy doesn't continue to have some issues at home. Actually, I'd argue, part of that shipping more goods overseas could be related to this anti-involution drive that Xi Jinping has really been on, that idea of too many low-cost goods really flooding the market in China, trying to export some of those. Obviously, though, that's still hitting at the bottom line for some of these good suppliers and producers. And you still continue to have some pretty significant problems when it comes to deflation within the Chinese economy, some concerns over consumer sentiment. So it really is a mixed bag. But I do think that the better than expected performance, at least at the start of the year, may enable China to still sort of get close to its growth targets for the year. Obviously, some of those external figures suggest maybe it comes in a little bit under. But yeah, it's been a really interesting year for China. And obviously, as we've been discussing here, they continue to seem to have leverage in any kind of trade negotiations with the U.S.
Thanks to both of you. That is Bloomberg's Jill Desis there, and also Brendan Murray. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Hong Kong has issued its third highest storm warning as Super Typhoon Ragasa tracks towards the financial hub. It's equivalent to a Category 4 hurricane. The typhoon has caused major flight disruptions, suspension of classes and business activities. It could potentially be the most damaging storm in Hong Kong since 2018. President Trump's threat of imposing tariffs as high as 250% on pharmaceutical imports is putting cheap supplies from Indian drug makers at risk. At the top of the list, birth control pills. Approximately 2/3 of all birth control pill prescriptions in the US last year were manufactured by just 2 India-based companies. Argentine assets surging after the US pledged financial support for President Javier Milei. In a post on X, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent vowed to provide, quote, all options for stabilization. Details of the aid could come after Bessent and President Trump speak with Milei today here in New York. Coming up, shares of Nvidia pulling back slightly after closing at a record, fueled by a $100 billion deal with OpenAI. More next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Shares of Nvidia pulling back from a record. That's after the announcement it will invest as much as $100 billion in OpenAI to support new data centers and other artificial intelligence infrastructure. Joining us now is Matt Bloxham, tech analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. So, Matt, we obviously saw that surge once again to the record for NVIDIA. I'm just curious, is NVIDIA getting itself into a loop where it has to continue to support suppliers who then continue to support NVIDIA? And where does that end?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's certainly been on the forefront of my mind today. The circularity in this deal that they're essentially paying over time $100 billion of cash to one of their biggest customers, OpenAI, to spend money on NVIDIA chips. So I think there's a kind of quite a bit to unpick there, and I think it will certainly make investors going forward a little bit more cautious about the quality and the nature of the revenue that NVIDIA is generating. Clearly, there is a lot of real demand out there in the marketplace that's being funded by other sources, but yeah, that is perhaps the biggest question mark about this deal. But it's a huge deal, 10 gigawatts of power, which is the peak capacity of New York City, just kind of underlines the amount of investment going into the AI space. And this is just one company, Microsoft, Google, Meta, other companies, they're all investing huge amounts of money in the same area.
Yeah, and I mean, based on yesterday's action, it does seem to be that any NVIDIA-linked stock goes higher whenever the market, decides that there's full faith and credit in NVIDIA, right? It almost seems like one of those kinds of stories, but yet there are others out there trying to compete, and Huawei is one of them. It has a 3-year campaign now to overtake NVIDIA. Is it possible?
I guess it's possible, but I certainly think it's not going to be happening for quite some years. Yeah, as you mentioned, Huawei yesterday to great fanfare talked about this 3-year roadmap to kind of close the gap on NVIDIA, but they're doing it in, I guess, a kind of fairly unsubtle way. They're not really matching NVIDIA on sophistication of the technology because they don't have access to the kind of really leading edge semiconductor technology that NVIDIA does, so they're having to do it through other means. And I think the reality is that for quite some time, certainly kind of developed Western countries are not going to go for that solution. It may well help to kind of wean Chinese companies off of NVIDIA technology. But yeah, I think there's still a very big gap between the technology NVIDIA is using and the technology that Huawei can get access to.
Fascinating. Matt, thank you so much. That's Matt Bloxham there of Bloomberg Intelligence. Coming up, Jimmy Kimmel is coming back. A look at what else is making headlines in your front page news next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Time now for your front page news. First up on the New York Times, ABC announcing that Jimmy Kimmel Live will return tonight. In a statement, Disney said that Kimmel's initial comments were, quote, ill-timed and thus insensitive, but that it decided to put the show back after conversations with Kimmel. At least one television group that owns some ABC affiliates said that it would not broadcast the show. Next up on the Washington Post, the Trump administration linking Tylenol to autism is causing alarm in the medical field. Doctors are concerned that the warning could prompt pregnant women to avoid Tylenol even when sick. They warn that drawing broad conclusions from incomplete evidence isn't just premature, but reckless. And on the FT, Argentina President Milei is due for high-stakes talks with President Trump today. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Monday that all options were on the table to support the struggling economy. The volatility and waning public support is the biggest test for Milei since he won election in 2023. Let's get to those markets now, because the Nasdaq 100 obviously hit a 27th record yesterday, and it was primarily thanks to Nvidia. The SOX index as well, up 1.6% in yesterday's session. We're pretty flat today, but if anything pointed to slight gains. Will those be gains related to an Nvidia type stock and all of its suppliers? Well, we shall see, but certainly gaining a little bit of steam today. On the other side of the coin, you have gold nearing 3,800. Rate cut bets, of course, but also perhaps a little hedging maybe here. The 10-year yield just down a basis point there. We're at 412.93. Slight move up at the front end of the curve, and the back end of the curve is staying where it is. Coming up, the dollar hedging story not over yet. That is the view from Juckes of Societe Generale. He joins us next. This is Bloomberg. It's 5:30 a.m. in New York City. Good morning. I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. World leaders in New York City. The UN General Assembly set to kick off in Midtown Manhattan. President Trump is scheduled to speak. Plain diplomacy. The U.S. ambassador to China says Washington and Beijing are in talks for a huge Boeing aircraft order. And U.S. stocks hit another record of the year. Investors await Fed Chair Powell's speech and the latest PMI data. So let's take a look at those futures. They were pointed lower yesterday after the 27th and 28th record of the year for the Nasdaq 100 and S&P. Right now we're back to flat, even on the Russell 2000. Pretty much tells you all you need to know. We had that AI trade boosting Nvidia-linked stocks yesterday, and also rate cut hopes continuing to stimulate demand, particularly for gold. I want to mention that it is very close to 3,800 right now. Let's take a look at yields. Not seeing a whole lot of movement there, a basis point or two more towards the front end of the curve. Look, that two-year yield almost back to 360 now, and we have the 10-year yield at 413.12 again, but that 30-year yield staying below 474. Do keep an eye on gold though. Look, it's up another 1.1% right now, $40. Let's get to some individual stocks to watch now. Here's Valerie Teitel. Valerie.
Good morning, Bonnie. Let's start with a check on NVIDIA, because this is really what powered the equity market session yesterday. It closed at a record high, and we're backing off of it this morning, just down 0.7%. But it was really the excitement around the deal they signed with OpenAI that led that S&P 500 to notch its 28th record this year. Let's move on to more deals. This one in the airline space. The U.S. and China are inching closer to a massive deal for Boeing airplanes. The stock of Boeing is up 2.5% in pre-market trade so far. Now, this is based on reporting that Bloomberg broke back late in August that the Chinese were looking at a deal for 500 Boeing airplanes, would be one of the largest airline deals signed in history, and that probably is just telling us that the relations between the U.S. and China are thawing just a bit if this deal is inching closer to fruition. Lastly, let's head over to the pharma space. A check on Kenvue. This is the maker of Tylenol, the maker of acetaminophen. Those shares were down 7% in the session yesterday, closed at a record low, but they're bouncing back this morning, up shy of just 6%. Perhaps the market was thinking that it would hear something maybe a bit worse from this the press conference that Trump gave yesterday, and so some of that sentiment is being unwound in the share price. But President Trump's call for pregnant women to avoid Tylenol did draw sharp criticism, from both scientists and researchers. The president announced the changes to the FDA policy in the White House yesterday.
So taking Tylenol is not good. Or I'll say it. It's not good. For this reason, they are strongly recommending that women limit Tylenol use during pregnancy unless medically necessary.
All right, Valerie, thank you so much. That's Valerie Teitel there in London. Well, we're also closely monitoring the dollar. Obviously, DXY down 10.25% year to date, its worst year on record. Kit Juckes of Societe Generale weighing in, writing this, quote, "I don't think the dollar hedging story is over, if only because overall exposure to the dollar remains very high. But I can certainly hear an echo with last year. There is a willingness to question negative sentiment about the US economic outlook and bearish dollar views. The market remembers what we did last September and October." I'm pleased to say Kit joins us now, Chief FX Strategy at SocGen. That last sentence sounded a little bit ominous, but in fact, last fall or last autumn, Kit, the dollar actually turned up and the yen and the euros suffered. What's different this time around?
I think what's different this time around, partly the dollar's stronger. I guess that gives you sort of a starting point that's slightly different. I do think that there's clearer evidence that the US economy is losing momentum. But the market is questioning it partly because there's a certain amount of distrust around the economic data. Ever since some of the sort of accuracy of the labor market numbers was questioned by the president, amongst others. And so we've got people who used to just look at the non-farm payroll numbers at the beginning of the month, and it kind of set off kind of a chain reaction in terms of sentiment. Now people are asking questions and they're not so sure, and they want more data. What happened last year was that round about now, pretty much exactly now, we started to get clear enough signs from the data that things weren't as bad as they looked, and the market repriced. I think we've had more of an accumulation. I think there's been more of a hit to consumer confidence. There are problems with the labor market that aren't just the shortage of new jobs. There's a shortage of labor to take those jobs, and it's hard to see how you get strong GDP coming from there. But there is still, there's still a debate. There's a transatlantic debate where I think some people in my job in the United States are more optimistic about the dollar than I am, and I sort of pick up there's more optimism about the US economy from the States. And finally, the other piece is I think there's a fairly clear sense that this administration would like a weaker dollar at this point, and that would help the US economy. And certainly listening to Stephen Merrin yesterday, that was kind of a theme that was there in the background. So I think the market's more confident about dollar weakness. Finally, I'll just say one other thing. The price of gold says something about demand for the dollar.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. We're close to 3,800. Is that signaling nervousness, Kit, or optimism? What's it signaling?
It's signaling demand. I think that's the piece. I think there's Bloomberg ran a story this morning or last night, not quite sure which, but about Chinese authorities trying to facilitate the storage of physical gold in China by countries that don't really want to put it somewhere in the US or the UK, say. I think those kind of stories that suggest a desire to have gold and not have gold, if you like, in Fort Knox or something, those are significant stories in terms of this kind of fracturing of the global financial system, but also kind of people pulling away from the dollar. So we shouldn't ignore them. That all of these things all add up to. There are people out there who don't want to invest a lot in the US. And frankly, the US has got a lot of bonds to sell.
Yeah, it's day after day now with gold's rise. You mentioned Stephen Myron at the Economic Club of New York yesterday. I'm curious as to what you thought about his thoughts on the neutral rate. Just let's have a listen to one of the little passages.
In my view, insufficiently accounting for the strong downward pressure on the neutral rate resulting from changes in border and fiscal policies is leading some to believe policy today is less restrictive than it actually is.
Which parts of that do not make any sense to you, Kit, if any?
I think that the issue for me with the way I would see the border controls and what's happening with some of those isn't necessarily pushing down. If it pushes down a neutral rate, it pushes down the real neutral rate because it pushes up inflation. But it's giving the United States a more difficult inflation growth trade-off. I don't know that the solution to a difficult growth inflation trade-off is to push for more growth and live with the inflation. I'm not sure that that's what the mandate requires. So, but I think, look, I think a debate about what the right neutral rate is fine. I think if the neutral rate is lower than it is, I still look at the US economy and say, well, it's very close to full employment. So how does that work? It's running substantial current account deficit. How does that work if the neutral rate's actually much lower? So I have some questions. But if the neutral rate is lower and US interest rates are going to be less high relative to the rest of the world going forwards, the dollar's going to be weaker.
Well, let's talk about that, because we have yields now. The 30-year yield is stuck around 375 and not really going anywhere. You've got a little bit of movement at the front end. What's fair value for the 10-year right now, Kit?
I don't know. I think that's part of the problem, because we're trying to get used to a world where, post the QE experiment and post these sort of super monetary policy accommodation after the financial crisis and then after COVID, we're trying to normalize term premia, and those are steepening curves. But I think that I think we should probably see that as short-term rates come down, we can get lower 10-year yields. The only thing that will prevent that happening would be the size of the supply and the concerns about inflation. So from where I sit staring at the foreign exchange market, I look and say, well, if you're trying to, if you're seeing a less attractive 10-year yield in real terms, and you're casting some doubt in investors' minds about how many more dollars they want to own, then the trade-off you'll get is eventually going to be you will get somewhat lower yields, but you might get more dollar weakness.
So what are your targets, rough targets for, euro dollar, for example? Do we go to 120 or beyond? And yen as well, given that the leadership race is now in full steam?
I think we'll get euro dollar to something like 125, which means I don't think we'll get to 130, and I think we'll get through 120. That would be the same kind of level as we reached in 2020 after the Fed cut rates very aggressively, obviously as a result of COVID. The same kind of rate as we saw in that run up that the euro got when there was optimism about economic growth back in 2017, 2018. I think those levels are eminently reachable. I don't think the European economy, as it's structured now, can cope with the kind of levels we saw, back after the financial crisis. If you like, certainly not 160, definitely not 140, and I can't really imagine 130. So those real peak levels that we saw then, we're just not going to see again.
Kit, thank you so much. Kit Juckes of Societe Generale joining us there. Now on to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Hong Kong has issued its third highest storm warning as super typhoon Ragasa tracks toward the financial hub. It's equivalent to a Category 4 hurricane. The typhoon has caused major flight disruptions, suspensions of classes and business activities. It could potentially be the most damaging storm in Hong Kong since 2018. President Trump's threat of imposing tariffs as high as 250% on pharmaceutical imports is putting cheap supplies from Indian drug makers at risk. At the top of the list, birth control pills. Approximately 65% of all birth control pill prescriptions in the US last year were manufactured by just 2 India-based companies. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon says he hopes President Trump and Indian Prime Minister Modi can reach an agreement. He spoke with the Times of India. When asked about the H-1B visas, Dimon said he will be engaging with stakeholders and policymakers. Coming up, wars in Ukraine and Gaza and potential plane orders. President Trump speaks today at the United Nations General Assembly. More on all that next. This is Bloomberg.
Is playing is a buyer, and next time if we see the immediate threat to our territory or to us, it can be different. So Putin is trying to escalate and also trying to test our unity and capabilities, but he's failing normally.
Estonia's foreign minister there. Well, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and much more are top of mind at this week's UN General Assembly. Global leaders flying into New York and Washington as the summit kicks off today. For more, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, Tyler Kendall. So, Tyler, President Trump is one of the UN's loudest critics. He's set to speak today. What is he going to say?
Right, exactly. I'm actually about to head over there ahead of these remarks at 9:50 a.m. Eastern, and we sort of already got a little bit of a preview from the administration. For example, something to put on your radar. The White House says that President Trump will likely push other countries to tighten their restrictions on asylum amid the broader push from the administration to curb migration into the U.S. So that's perhaps going to be playing in the backdrop as well. But of course, there are two conflicts that are really going to take center stage stage. One, of course, the war in Ukraine. President Trump sent to meet with the Ukrainian president later today. And then the war between Israel and Hamas. As we've seen, some of these U.S. allies move to recognize a Palestinian state. We are expecting President Trump to defend Israel's right to defend itself. But you alluded to it at the beginning, sort of looming over these remarks today is that President Trump will likely point out that the U.S. has been the United Nations' largest financial backer, but he feels hasn't gotten that much from the organization. In fact, if you look at the numbers, the U.S. has stopped paying its bills to the United Nations since President Trump took office. Combine that with delinquencies from prior administrations, the U.S. currently is on the hook for $3 billion in dues and payments to the organization.
And technically, the UN could kick the U.S. right out of the council. Who is he going to meet this week?
So there's a set of meetings set for today. We know, for example, he's going to meet with the UN Secretary General, European Union leaders. We're going to be watching that very closely, particularly on the trade front. But then there's two leaders that I would highlight. One, he's set to meet with the Argentinian President Javier Milei, and we sort of got a preview yesterday from the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. In this post on X, he spoke about this idea that ultimately the U.S. will help keep Argentina from falling back into a crisis, adding that, quote, all options of stabilization are on the table. He went on to explain what this could mean. Options could include, but aren't limited to, currency swap lines as one example. And then the other leader to point out, as I mentioned, he's going to be meeting with the Ukrainian President Zelensky today. And there's a lot, of course, that they could be discussing. But we know that Ukraine is going to be pushing this administration for those stricter security guarantees. They want to see a more robust commitment from the U.S. To match what we've seen from some of our other allies. Of course, as you well know, the administration has been pushing other nations to sort of take the forefront when it comes to security guarantees, but also in particular when it comes to some of those more punitive actions. This administration is calling on our allies to implement so-called secondary tariffs like they've done against India for its imports of Russian energy supplies.
All right, it could be a long day, Tyler. I hope you got some sleep last night. That is Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, Tyler Kendall. Over in Beijing, U.S. and Chinese officials are in the final stages of talks over what they're calling a huge order for Boeing aircraft. This after a delegation of House representatives ended 2 days of meetings with Chinese leaders. Take a listen to U.S. Ambassador to China, David Perdue.
This is a huge order, and it's very important to the president. It's very important to Boeing. I think it's very important to China. And I think that we're in the last days of that, or weeks of that negotiation, and we're hopeful that that will turn out to be the case.
Brendan Murray is back with us now. Brendan, thank you. So obviously this helps Boeing. You know, what does it do for the United States in general and Beijing too?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this would be a big feather in President Trump's cap to sell that many airplanes, some 500 to China for the first Boeing sale to China since 2017. That would keep Boeing busy for years in terms of on top of the backlog it already has. So that would be a key ask of the United States if a trade deal with China is going to be concluded in the next several weeks. However, you know, there are a lot of other details that need to be hammered out, and you know, it still could be months before we see any sort of comprehensive deal put together. But the hope is, and it's sounding more and more like optimism from both sides, that the meeting that Presidents Trump and Xi plan to have in Korea at the end of October at the APEC meeting could be the basis for some sort of deal that they could put together that would involve these airplanes and other things like purchases of U.S. soybeans, which China hasn't purchased many of lately. So that would be the hope. President Trump really wants to do this deal with China, and the Boeing sale would be a big part of it.
You know, I want to ask you about India because obviously we had, you know, chaos at the weekend with this H-1B $100,000 fee farrago. Secretary Rubio, though, calling India of, quote, critical importance to the U.S. despite the visa policy disproportionately affecting India. Was that a message to India? What is the latest on trade talks and just general relations between the two?
Yeah, things sound to be, it sounded like they're starting to warm a bit. The two leaders exchanged pleasantries last week, and it sounded like the relationship between the U.S. and India was headed back on track. And then these H-1B visa announcements came out and added complexity to an already difficult situation. The U.S. is asking India to stop purchasing Russian energy and wants India to open its agricultural markets to U.S. exporters. So there's a lot of asks, a lot of big asks. The tone seems to be right, but the momentum isn't yet moving in the direction of any sort of deal in the short term. So these are the kinds of things that will be part of the talks at the UN this week.
Brendan, thank you so much. As always, that's Brendan Murray there. Turning to tech now, shares of Nvidia falling in the pre-market, but they closed at a record high. That's after the chipmaker announced it will invest as much as $100 billion in OpenAI to support new data centers and other AI infrastructure. Let's get more from Matt Bloxham, tech analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Matt, is all this getting a little uncomfortable with Nvidia? I don't want to say propping up its suppliers, but certainly, issuing public support, and at the moment everyone believes in the full faith and credit of Nvidia, but is it that strong? Is it that healthy? Can it do this continually?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some question marks there about the circularity of this deal. Essentially, over time spending or giving $100 billion of cash to OpenAI in exchange for equity, but then essentially OpenAI using that money to buy Nvidia technology. So I think it would definitely start to kind of challenge people to kind of maybe probe a little bit more the revenue going forward. Obviously, it's not the only deal like this. I mean, we've seen quite a few announcements from Nvidia recently around investments to kind of kickstart AI projects in a number of countries, including here in the UK recently. But I think that there's clearly a sign there that there's a huge amount of investment still to come into the AI space. Some estimates suggest that up to $3 trillion of investment in AI data centers over the next 5 or 6 years. So, it's a big area and it's definitely not going to go away anytime soon for sure.
All right, Matt. Well, Nvidia down this morning, but we'll see if that holds throughout the day. That's Matt Bloxham of Bloomberg Intelligence. Coming up, awaiting Chair Powell and President Trump will get you set up for your trading day. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Now a look at what's ahead today. First up, the latest round of PMI data. That's out at 9:45 Eastern Time. That's followed by President Trump's remarks at the United Nations General Assembly later this morning. Also, Fed Chair Powell will speak on the central bank's economic outlook. That's at 12:30 Eastern, and a big focus. Let's have a look at some stocks moving pre-market. Micron, earnings coming after the close. Well, it is rising 1.2%. Shares are up almost 96% year to date for that company. Boeing, US and China obviously getting closer to this huge aircraft order apparently following talks in Beijing, and that stock continues to rise pre-market up 2.5% now. And then Tylenol maker Kenvue is rising, having dropped substantially. We'll check out how that moves throughout the day. It is recouping some of Monday's drop as President Trump's call for pregnant women to avoid the drug draws sharp criticism from researchers. Let's take a look at the macro environment. After the SOX index was up 1.6% and we hit a 27th record for the Nasdaq 100. Futures very slightly higher. We'll see how Nvidia and those linked stocks move today. Not too much movement on the 10-year, down a couple of basis points to 412.54. Gold bears watching, up another 1%, close to 3,800. That is it, though, for Bloomberg Brief. Surveillance is next. This is Bloomberg.